has been living in Jerusalem for 15 generations. I spent 15 years out of the first 18 years outside of Israel due to my father's job as a diplomat. He was Israel's ambassador in Chile, Colombia, and Turkey. So I was educated in American and British schools. I graduated from a British high school in Rome and returned for my military service at the age of 18. And I spent 30 years in the military, participating in all the big operations and wars and everything that went on in the last 30 years. And in the last 3 years, I've been dealing mostly with policy and also a bit with high tech. I was always concerned about ideas that were led by high-ranking security officials talking about the need for Israel to seize more land, to retreat all the way to the Green Line, which we'll cover afterwards. And I believe that these ideas present an existential threat to Israel if they are implemented. So I felt the need to build a new organization, Habithonistim, which is in Hebrew, the translation is the security experts. In English, by the way, they call us protectors of Israel. And we established the organization in February, and within 3 months, more than 1,000 high-ranking officers, field commanders, and warriors joined the organization, and we're growing very, very fast. Each day, more and more officers and fighters are joining the organization because this voice was needed. It's the voice of classic Zionistic values and security agenda, which in the past, talking 20, 30 years ago, everybody in Israel shared. And within time, things changed and new ideas came about. And as I said, I think we're talking about ideas that endanger Israel existentially. Now, your organization is talking about supporting Israel within defensible lines. And what I would like to talk about here is actually what are defensible lines, what is not defensible, and what is defensible, and what does Israel need to thrive and to be secure, not in the next 5 years, not in the next 10 or 20 years, but hundreds of years ahead, taking in account that we don't really know what will happen in the future. We're not able really to say exactly what will be the threats. So basically, a nation that exists 4,000 years needs to be able to look at least 1,000 years ahead and make sure that the nation lives along defensible borders against any future threat. So let me start before I go into details talking about how to secure Israel. Let's talk about a few minutes about what's going on around us in the Middle East. So we're seeing here the map of the Middle East. The map represents the borders of the nations as they were created 100 years ago by the British and the French, who decided after the First World War how the Middle East will look. Before that, there were no states at all, maybe a part of Egypt. It was all, for hundreds of years, part of the Turkish Empire, and before that, other empires. So basically, all these countries we are seeing here, whether it's Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, and so on, these are all pretty much new states that were created by European entities that didn't exist before. And they have no real history before they were created. And of course, the way they were created is mixing lots of different ethnic groups that don't necessarily really interact well one with each other. and create new states that they are somewhat artificial. Why am I saying all this history? Because after 100 years, this thing is starting to fall apart. In the last 10 years, we are seeing a phenomena that all these states that were created and maybe didn't really make sense are falling apart. We see Syria with different groups, Sunnis, Shias, Kurds, and so on, fighting each other. The same goes for Lebanon, which today is in a very, very difficult situation and on the brink of a civil war between different groups, whether it's Shias, Sunnis, Druze, Christians, or living in this very small country called Lebanon. Iraq, that pretty much hardly exists as a state today, also with the Kurds in the north that are practically almost autonomous completely, with a big fight between the Sunnis and the Shias. The Shias backed up by Iran, the Sunnis backed up by Saudi Arabia. So when we look at the Middle East, there is a lot of question marks. What will happen in the future? I'm not sure Jordan will exist within 10 years. I don't know what will happen with Saudi Arabia and all the small Gulf states around the Persian Gulf. They are all facing a big threat from Iran. They are facing inner problems. So the Middle East overall is poor. The economies are in a very, very bad shape. Corona is affecting everybody, of course. A big war all over the place between Shias and Sunnis. And all the different states are dealing with inner survivability of their own governments. So in one way, you could say, okay, this is an opportunity for Israel because all these countries today seek some kind of collaboration with Israel, mainly because they are afraid of the Iranian regime, because they want Israeli high-tech. And of course, they need to change their economy from oil to a modern economy. By the way, in the last 10 years, and especially during the Obama administration, it became the first time that the United States is producing more oil for export than the Middle East. So basically before the United States depended on Middle East oil and therefore had a lot of interest in this area. And now, but suddenly the Middle East has become a place that is a rival, an economic rival to the States, talking about export of oil. And this is something that is affecting a lot, first of all, the motivation of the United States to be involved in the Middle East. It's much less interesting than before. And on the other hand, the Arab countries are worried that they are losing power, and they are losing power, international power, because the issue of oil is not as important as it was before. Today, you have some countries that are moderate, but inside them you have jihadists and terrorists, and it's not obvious who will win the day after all. So Israel, in this sense, has to be ready for any scenario, and I don't see anything optimistic that I can talk about when I talk about the Middle East. The Middle East is one big mess, and it's not going to change in any near future, and I would say not even in the next 50 or 100 years. This huge fight between Shias and Sunnis, this huge fight between moderates and jihadists, the fight within the states, the fight between different ethnic groups, is something that is going to continue. And in many occasions, when all these different elements fight each other, sometimes it's better for them to join against a common enemy, and that's Israel. So basically looking at 400 million Muslims that are surrounding the very, very small state of Israel. And I don't know if you realize how small Israel is. You know, I spent a lot of years outside of Israel, and Israel, you hear about Israel so much that when you ask people, how many Israelis do you think there are, or how big is the state of Israel, they think it's maybe like the United States or something like that. But from the Mediterranean Sea and all the way to the Jordan River, Israel is 70 miles. And this includes all of Judea and Samaria. 70 miles, 45 miles, it's 70 kilometers, 45 miles from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. This is the land of Israel, that's it. 45 miles. Think about it, it's not even the size of probably of your own city. And this is a state, the one and only Jewish state that needs to keep all the Jews secure, even the ones that are not in Israel now. And maybe we'll make Aliyah later on. 45 miles, that's it. If we go more into depth, what is Israel without Judea and Samaria? If we look at the left map, what we see in the left map is Judea and Samaria in the light brown, the rest of Israel in yellow, and we see also Gaza, light brown underneath. So basically, Israel without Judea and Samaria, from the sea to what is called the Green Line, or the line, the 49th Armistice Line, at the end of the Independence War in 48-49. The distance between Netanya and this line is 9 miles. 9 miles. I mean, guys, I jog 9 miles in the morning. Think about the concept of jogging your own country for 1.5 hours, maybe in the morning. It's inconceivable. But it gets even more complicated than that, because if we go into topography, what we see is that the mountains of Judea and Samaria, which are pretty high mountains in Israeli standard, it's around 800 meters. I'm not sure in your measures how much this is, but they completely overlook the shallow areas of Tel Aviv, Kfar Saba, and all the major cities of Israel, which reside along the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. So basically, when you stand anywhere on these mountains, you see everything. Not necessarily here in the middle of the mountains. You stand and you see all the buildings of Tel Aviv in the shore. In ancient times, the Jews lived in the mountains, and we, the Jewish people in those mountains, we won against empires, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. We won against huge empires because the one who controls the mountains controls Israel. At the end of the day, when you talk about the land of Israel is the mountains of Judea and Samaria, which we see here, with 9 miles of the Jordan Valley and 9 miles of the coast. But the heart, the center of gravity, the place where you actually control this very small area, this 45 miles, it mostly consists of the mountains of Judea and Samaria, and it's exactly those mountains that are in dispute. Now I'm going to say something very clear. There is no existence, physical existence, to the state of Israel without the mountains of Judea and Samaria. Israel cannot exist, cannot defend itself nobody has ever presented a plan, not even all the commanders who say that we can retreat. Nobody has ever presented a plan that explains how you can remain a country with the width of 9 miles and defend it without full control of all of the mountains and the Jordan Valley, that is the natural barrier between the mountains of Jordan, the high ground of Jordan, and the high ground of Judea and Samaria. Now, what I'm saying here was understood, clear. Nobody discussed it in Israel until I would say after the murder of late Prime Minister Rabin, 95, 96, maybe the beginning of 2000. All the political parties in Israel until then agreed and believed that in order for Israel to exist, to reside in defensible borders, Israel needs the Jordan Valley as its natural border that prevents from anything, from all this turbulent Middle East we talked about before, from entering into this area. And of course, it needs full control of the mountains. And when I say full control, there is no full control without a massive presence of citizens. It's the citizens that live along the main roads. We see 3 of them. They are not the only ones, but the major ones. Road number 1, that goes all the way from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea. Road number 5, that goes all the way from Tel Aviv to the Jordan Valley and crosses on the way the city of Ariel. And the backbone of Judea and Samaria, Road 60. This is the road of the forefathers. This is the main road that in biblical times, everything went on. Anybody who wanted to move around Israel moved along this biblical road. And today, it's also the main road of Judea and Samaria. And all over this road, you have Jewish towns. And the same goes here, and the same goes here, and in some other main roads. And what enables the IDF to operate freely and move from one place to the other is massive Jewish presence and cars, Israeli cars that drive in all these roads. By the way, they drive also with Palestinian cars, and there is not I would say a very good coexistence actually in everyday life. Now, just to explain this map, what we see here is the product of the Oslo Agreement. What we see here is the dark brown areas. They are called areas A. These are the major cities, Palestinian cities. And in these places, the Palestinian Authority is in full control and sovereignty, both talking about the civilian life and security. In the yellow areas, and this is the villages around the main cities of the Palestinians, in these areas, the Palestinians are responsible for all the civil matters, and the IDF, or Israel for that matter, is responsible for security. Now, today, because the IDF operates everywhere here, if there is a ticking bomb, if, for example, somebody inside Ramallah wants to build mortars, the IDF will operate and arrest him in his house. And in order to do this today, all that is needed is maybe 2-3 cars with maybe 12 to 16 soldiers that go in, apprehend the terrorists, and go out. Now, if we had to do this today in Gaza, where we are not inside, apprehending one terrorist in Gaza is full-scale war with rockets, with tens of thousands of rockets, with anti-missiles, anti-tank missiles, and so on. There is no way, and it doesn't happen, that knowing that terrorists are operating inside Gaza, we are able to do something because we don't control the areas. So once you are not inside, they can do anything they want, build any terror infrastructure they want, and the only way to deal with it is or a very big scale operation with thousands of people hurt or dead, or a full-scale war. This is the reality of Gaza. This is the reality with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And this is not a reality Israel can live with in the Judea and Samaria. Now we tried something like that before the year 2000. We retreated completely from all the brown areas and didn't operate inside there. Within 1 year, these places became huge terrorist areas, and the result was more than 1,000 Israelis killed, with suicide bombers exploding every day in Tel Aviv, in Kfar Saba, in Netanya, in Hedera, in Afula, in Jerusalem, everywhere. And it stopped only when we did a full-scale operation, conquered everything back, later on gave the civil management back to the Palestinians, but it took 6 years to overcome this threat. And all this taking in account that in all this time, we just retreated from these areas. We didn't open the Jordan Valley. We didn't let them bring more weapons inside Judea and Samaria. And their capabilities were not that high at the time, and still they managed to completely disrupt Israeli life. The economy, Israeli economy was completely destroyed, and we needed a war here to change the situation. So anybody who claims that we can retreat from the Jordan Valley, retreat from Judea and Samaria, all the way to this green line and leave Israel with 9 miles, send him to me. I want to hear what's his idea of how you can defend Israel this way. Now, today, we need to understand what is the discourse. What are we talking about? There is only 2 options, and within those 2 options, there are different mini scenarios, let's say, for this option. Today, there is a group that since 2000 is saying the following. He's saying, listen, we don't want to control the Palestinians. We don't want to mix with them. We want them to be on one side of the border. We will be on the other side of the border. And this is called the separation plan. And in this plan, Israel retreats to the Green Line, lives for maybe 10 years, 5 years, 15 years, I don't know, forces along the Jordan Valley, and maybe also in these areas. It means hundreds of thousands of Jews will be thrown from their houses. It means that everything that the Jewish people came back for, all our religious places, all our heritage, the tomb of our forefathers, everything we give up, which brings a very big question whether we have a reason to be here at all. We didn't come back for Tel Aviv. And within 10 or 15 years, they say, okay, listen, maybe 10, 15 years, maybe the Palestinians will change, maybe things will change in the Middle East. And then the IDF will retreat, and maybe we'll put some international forces. Of course, we never saw anything international working anywhere. And that's it. And the way we, the Habithonistim, we see it, this is, I would say, almost a kind of messianic way of thinking. What exactly is supposed to happen in 10 or 15 years? Are we going to see a new Middle East? And what will happen if there is no new Middle East? Practically, we're saying that we're putting the future of the Jewish people, the future of Israel, in Arabs' hands. This is the separation plan. And it needs to be said because there is a lot of camouflage. People are saying, yes, you know, the Jordan Valley is really important. And yes, of course, that the mountains of Judea and Samaria are important. And yes, we leave the army and you know, for a few years. And it makes people think, okay, this guys actually think about Israel's security, but it's not true. The fact is that this ideas is the first step for the end of the state of Israel. And this is something we cannot live with. So, you know that when Oslo agreement was done in 92, and in 2-3 years later, Prime Minister Rabin gave his last and very famous discourse about what are the red lines that Israel will never cede. He said 3 things. 1, Israel will never, ever divide Jerusalem. The other thing is, Israel will always keep the Jordan Valley, this area here in blue, that this is Israeli area anyway, in its most broader sense. When Rabin says its most broader sense, it means from the river all the way to the high ground that controls it. This is the most broader sense. In Israeli hands, so we can control and have a defensible border against all the Middle East. And Israel will always keep the towns in Judea and Samaria to ensure that we have the ability to control what's going on here. So the perception, even in Oslo, even in Rabin's view, was that the Palestinian entity might be a state, but this state will be something like Luxembourg. This state will be something like the Vatican. You know, the Vatican is a state with passports and everything. They have representatives in the UN and so on, but the Vatican is a state the size of maybe a neighborhood inside a city of another state with no airspace and no army and so on, and it's a state. So basically, what we're saying is, yes, we don't want to control the Palestinians. We don't want to decide for them in the everyday life what will they do, how they will live their life, but we cannot survive without having a border that enables us to prevent anything to go in from the Middle East to Judea and Samaria, and without controlling Judea and Samaria. And what I'm saying here, it's exactly 100% Trump's plan. Everything I talked about now is acknowledged by the American administration and then is presented as a plan for peace. And in this plan, it adheres to everything Rabin said. No division of Jerusalem, the Jordan Valley in Israeli hands, and all the communities and towns remain, and Israel has full security responsibility. Now, if we don't have full security responsibility, the first ones that will suffer from that will be the Palestinians. We will see what happened in Gaza. The Palestinians will lose their own government to the Hamas, to the Jihad, to ISIS, to all the radical elements that Israel today fights in order to keep the Palestinian Authority alive. The Palestinian Authority cannot survive without Israel. By the way, Jordan cannot survive without Israel. We are the country that is stabilizing both Jordan and the Palestinian Authority. And any attempt to change that will endanger Israel, will endanger the Palestinians, and will endanger Jordan. So it wouldn't be a clever move. This is why we Habithonistim were very, very supportive of Trump's plan. Because I think that basically it adheres to all the security needs of Israel. It also adheres to the, not only to the security needs, but also the need to be in the places that we came back for. Places like Shiloh, where the Ark resided for hundreds of years. Places like Bethel, places like the cave of our forefathers. This is what we came back for. This is our heritage. This is our history. This is the reason why we are here in the first place. And if you give this up, it doesn't matter how many tanks you have, how many airplanes you have. There will be no energy and no reason why fight. We wouldn't be able to explain to ourselves why I live in Tel Aviv and not in New York. It's not only about the standard of living. This is about Zionism. This is about why we came back to the land of Israel. And this is what we need in order to survive. You know, one of our generals, General Gershon Cohen, wrote a very interesting book that is called What is Nationalistic About National Security? There is no national security without a sense of nationalism, a sense of why we are here. And everything, all the reasons why we are here reside within Judea and Samaria. So both looking at it from a technical security stance and looking at it also from a more nationalistic, Zionistic point of view, this is why we need this place. Having said that, I would like to enable you to ask questions. I'm sure you have very good questions and I would like to answer them. So please.
All right, Amir, thank you. First of all, thank you very, very much for your wonderful presentation. I do want to mention that everyone that has a question, please write them in the chat or on our Facebook Live, and we're going to be asking them as you write the questions. So please write your questions in the chat so we can ask them, Amir. Also, Amir brought many talking points that we host in SSI many speakers over the past months with many different opinions and expertise, and we are happy that our students have the ability to pick what they can use for campus, what they can use for their activism, different talking points and different opinions that the expertise bring to the organization. Now, the first question, Amir, is the following. Will the Trump plan will stick if the United States elects a different government? Like, are you aware from a strategic perspective, if in the elections, the different government being elected in the United States, are we still hoping that the United States will stick to the plan of the century or not?
I am pretty sure that it won't happen. I think that Republicans and Democrats are very far away from each other. And this is what worries me, because if we don't apply sovereignty now, according to Trump's plan and as part of an American plan, if we don't do it now and Trump is not elected, I would estimate that we might go back to what was Obama's plan. And the idea in Obama's plan was to retreat all the way to the indefensible borders of the Green Line and suggest that American forces or UN forces will take care of Israel's security. In the past, by the way, I'm not talking about the right wing, I'm talking about the left governments in the 70s, 60s. They called the Green Line the Auschwitz Line. The feeling in Israel was that these lines are lines of a concentration camp. And we're not going back to concentration camps. So we need to sort it out now. And Habithonistim, we're pushing very, very hard, both with the Prime Minister of Israel and with the administration, to understand that although they're dealing with Corona, and although both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump are dealing with difficult political issues and with upcoming elections, they need to understand that this is probably the most strategic and important decision for the future of the state of Israel for generations to come. So I believe, by the way, that they need it also politically. Both of them need to get out from Corona. There is no winning in the Corona crisis, really, and move to something much more fruitful and important. And it's applying sovereignty over the Jewish towns, over the Jordan Valley. And I want to remind everybody, when we talk about Trump's plan doesn't apply Israeli sovereignty on any Palestinian at all. The Palestinian Authority remains as it is. They control their own people. There are Palestinian civilians. We control Israeli civilians. There is everyday economical interaction between the two entities. There is no economy in the Palestinian towns without interacting every day with the Jewish towns. So it's coexistence.
Great. The next question will be from our president at Columbia University, Ophir, and she is asking then, what do you think should be the status of the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, and if sovereignty is extended over those areas? You did just mention that they will be under the PA, but like, what, to your opinion, what do you think should be their status?
I don't think that in any scenario, we should extend our sovereignty to areas A and B that are controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And I was asked by very high-ranking officers, what will happen if the Palestinian Authority falls? And I can say that there are a lot of different scenarios of different ways of having the Palestinians controlling their own people. I can say that, you know, we have a lot of discussions in Israel, but if there is one thing that everybody agrees, left, right, center, is that we are interested in the idea that the Palestinians will continue to control their own future within their own towns. Now, I myself, as you said at the beginning, I'm not going to elaborate about that. This is a different, maybe a talk that we'll have in a different occasion. I myself have been promoting, together with Benjamin Anthony from the Miriam Institute, and before that, Our Soul to Speak, an initiative that anchors a Palestinian state in Gaza and in the Sinai Peninsula. So we see here Gaza, we see this northern part of the Sinai Peninsula, which is Egyptian soil. But we believe that if we don't bring more land into the discussion, there is no real solution for a viable Palestinian state, because I think that having 2 million Palestinians locked up in an area of 3.5 miles forever, this is the two-state solution, by the way. Anybody who thinks that the two-state solution is a good idea, the two-state solution is sticking 2 million Palestinians in this small area here forever, and having a mini state or a Vatican state or a Luxembourg state here. So basically, if we actually really want a viable Palestinian state, we need more land for the discussion. And I want to show you an interesting slide. Look, this is Israel in the night. This is Egypt that continues to build this civilization around the Nile. This is the Sinai Peninsula. So what potential do we see in Israel? None. Look at the lights. All the way from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan Valley. Already today, look how packed it is. And I believe that in the next 10 years, hundreds of thousands of Jews will come to Israel, from Europe mainly, also from the States. And we need space. We need space to evolve, not only now, but also talking about 100 years from now, and so on. So what can we see there anymore? But look at the Sinai Peninsula. This is the real potential, and a place where solutions can be found for the Palestinians. to evolve, and we need to start thinking more on a regional solution. There is no solution for two states in an area with the width of 45 miles, as I said in the beginning.
Okay, great. And actually, right now we have a lot of questions that came in as you started speaking. And you did mention Benjamin Anthony, so it's a great friend of SSI. He actually came to speak on our campuses in the past. So he's a big supporter of our organization. We're happy to know that you guys work together. Our next question, Amir, would be, in your presentation, you mentioned that the people who control the mountains control the land. And you ran a whole history lecture about how it was accurate in biblical times and how it's still accurate today. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the Jordan Valley, though? What is happening in the Jordan Valley, which is in between the mountains and Jordan, and the importance of that valley to Israel as well?
Well, as I mentioned, the Jordan Valley is the natural barrier between the mountains of Jordan and the mountains of Judea and Samaria. Jordan is a state that deals today with a situation where almost 50% of the population is people that poured it into Jordan from Iraq, from Syria, million people that came also from Egypt, because there is great hunger now in Egypt and people are moving into Jordan. So Jordan has a very strong presence of Hamas and the Muslim Brothers. And at the end of the day, it's a country that is controlled by a minority, just like Syria. So maybe less than 10% Bedouins that are reigning Jordan are reigning 90% people who are mostly Palestinian or from different groups. So it's not a very stable country, and it's also a very poor country. So Israel, by being here in the Jordan Valley, assists dramatically the Jordanians, and also we make sure that there is no connection between the Palestinians here and here, because if the Palestinian Authority would have control here, they would immediately bring down Jordan. So the Jordanians' interest is having Israel in the Jordan Valley. Now, you would ask me, but how come? I mean, the Jordan king is saying that if Israel will apply sovereignty, he will be very mad and so on. Okay, he needs to say that for his people. But when we talk with Jordanian officials, they say, guys, please stay here. Don't go anywhere. We don't mind you applying sovereignty.
Now, Amir, I want to ask you two questions to combine them into one from Lionel Chazan. He's the president in SSI at Santa Barbara, at University of California, Santa Barbara. So his two questions are the following. The Palestinians made it very clear that they won't accept this sort of plan, referring to the Trump plan. So can there be any negotiations with people that don't want to negotiate with you? The second question that he asked, it's, do you see the Palestinians themselves agreeing on using parts of Sinai as a potential territory for their country? Because he says that seems very difficult. So what do you think about those two questions?
Okay, it's very different questions. I would say this. When I was in the White House, before the Trump plan, there is one thing I said that I was very happy to see that actually was done. We said, look, till the Trump's plan, each time the idea was, okay, or we get the Palestinians to agree to something, or there is status quo. Now, it's important to understand, and it might surprise maybe some of our listeners, the last thing on earth the Palestinians want is a state. They don't want a state, because if they wanted a state, they would have had a state a long time ago. They don't want a state for a very simple reason, because their existence is about fighting Israel and being the underdog and getting billions and billions of dollars with not doing anything and having no responsibility over their people. They know that if they become a state, that's it. International community won't deal with them anymore, because really, what do they have to offer to the international community? They have no high-tech, no economy, no oil, nothing. In another scenario, nobody would ever even talk to them. They have nothing to offer to anybody. So the only way they can be relevant in their eyes is by keeping the fight, not having a state. Now, they will always say no, because they don't want a state. They want to fight. They want to be relevant. They want to get money for free. This is the biggest high-tech success in the world. Nobody gains like the Palestinians for not doing anything. And so basically, the change that Trump's plan did is saying to the Palestinians, listen, guys, there is no status quo anymore. If you don't come to the talks, if you don't agree, Israel will get what Israel is entitled to get anyway. So it's either a win-win or a win-lose. There is no status quo. And this is a huge, huge, huge change of policy. It's a very clever change of policy. Because now they understand that when they say no, they pay a price. Israel will get what it deserves. So basically, this is why the administration says, okay, Israel, you can apply sovereignty now, whether the Palestinians agree or not. Now, talking about the next question, which is a very different question, but I'll address it. When we talk about a new idea, completely new one, anchoring a state for the Palestinians in Gaza and in the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula, before we even talk about the Palestinians and whether they agree or not, I think that it's time for Israel to have its own initiative. It's time for Israel to put its own plan forward. It's time for Israel to demand the Arab world to assist as well in this issue if they think should be a Palestinian state. And I care more about our ability to convince the United States that it's a good idea, to convince Europe that it's a good idea, to convince the Sunni Arab world that it's a good idea, long before I'm worried about the Palestinians. Because at the end of the day, if the international community will think that this is a good solution, it will be pushed forward. Now, remember that there are 2 million Palestinians, as I said, locked in this small area of Gaza. They need this desperately, and this is half of the Palestinians. So I believe that anyway, half of them will say, okay, sure, why not? Why not get much more land and jobs and a Riviera and hotels and casinos? Sure, of course they will go for it. I mean, I don't know if you know that 70% of the Gazans in the Palestinian polls are saying that the moment somebody opens the Rafah crossing, they're going to go out and that's it. They're not going back. You know, people many times say that Palestinians or Muslims are really attached to the land. And I say, sure, the land of Germany. Everybody is moving to Europe. This is the land they are attached to. Millions of Muslims moving from the Middle East to Europe. So we have these preconceptions. We think we understand these people, but most of them want a solution for their everyday life. If they could move to, they would have moved to Europe long ago. And certainly if they are offered a solution where they have a decent life, they will consider it very seriously.
Okay, great. And we have 2 more questions. We're about to hit the 1 hour and we have 2 more questions that we want to ask you. And they are the following. The first one, and not has to do with Judea and Samaria, but has to do with a little bit of what's happening up north right now. We are following the news from Israel. We see that some stuff are happening up north. If you can just briefly tell us what is going on. Are we waiting for something bad to happen? Hopefully not. And the second question would be that we know that many IDF officers and commanders, when they leave the army, some join the political world, and they also push towards different directions. You know, some of them push more towards the left, some of them push more towards the right. So how do you see your organization involvement on the influence that you can make on the political level?
Well, talking about the North, I would use this example. I talked before I had this Zoom, I was in TV, and I explained something very interesting about what's going on in the North. Look, we have a terrorist organization, namely Hezbollah, who wants to send one terrorist cell to do an attack somewhere, and all of the IDF, from the Prime Minister, going to the Minister of Defense, the Chief of Staff, all the Northern Command, all the country is dealing with one terrorist cell that wants to maybe shoot one anti-tank missile or something like that into Israel. All the towns along the northern border are affected by that. All the media is dealing with that. And this is for one reason only. We don't control the area on the other side. So look at these mountains here in Lebanon, this area. Think about one terrorist group and all of Israel is dealing with it. And by the way, each time Hezbollah wanted to shoot, and we knew they are going to shoot, and we used all of our resources to try to find this terrorist group. In all of the times that this happened, they shot. We didn't manage to prevent them shooting. And this is by one terrorist cell and all of the IDF looking for it. This is to explain to you the limits of power. Anybody who says to you, listen, the IDF is the strongest army in the Middle East, no problem. Let's cede all of the mountains here and go all the way back here. Remember, one terrorist cell and all of the IDF is trying to prevent something that it cannot prevent. Why? Because we're not controlling the area. So basically now, maybe 2, 3, 4 days, we'll have this tension around one terrorist organization and one cell. But the overall strategic situation is that the Hezbollah don't want a war, we don't want a war. They have a lot of problems of their own. In Lebanon, in Syria, they are very busy with their own problems. So I guess that there won't be anything too dramatic at the end of the day. And so this is about that. And what was the other question?
So the next question is, how do you think your organization can impact
the political level? Okay.
Impact the political level?
Well, I think that Protectors of Israel, Habithonistim movement, can have a huge, huge impact on Israeli society. Our long-term plan is bringing back the classic Zionistic values and the classic national security agenda. As I talked in this presentation, we are talking to everybody in the political arena. We are not a political party. We don't support any party. We don't support any politician. In this sense, we are pushing our ideas, but we don't belong to any political side. And, you know, obviously people look at us and say, you guys, you are the generals of the right. But in my perspective, I think that national security is relevant to everybody, and it's a discussion that is relevant for all the Israeli society, and it's not the definition of left or right that can arrange this issue. It's a much broader issue than politics on the party level, and this is how we see it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, first of all, Amir, I would like to thank you very, very much for a wonderful presentation. I know that there are many, many talking points that students can take with them to campuses and choose what would work best for them on their own campuses. We would be more than happy to stay in touch, and hopefully that when the whole COVID issue is over, we can also see you here in North America as well. Sure. Keep learning.
So maybe next time we bring Benjamin, we talk about the new state solution, because it's a fascinating issue.
Oh yeah, for sure. So we thank you, Amir, for your expertise, and we wish you all best.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thanks
You for joining.